Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. It's a pleasure to welcome Mary Kissel of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal and the host of Opinion Journal at WSJ.com, back from her Australian adventure. She is rested, although sometimes you'd have to say not at the correct hours for the East Coast time. Good evening, Mary.
Good evening, John. Great to be back.
Welcome back. And Mary, the news has waited for your return. And so tonight we arranged it that there was nothing but alarming news in all areas: domestic, foreign policy, political news, chaos. In fact, to my understanding, Washington has ceased to exist tonight. It's one great big gossip session. So it's a pleasure to have you here, because we're going to plunge immediately into the Affordable Care Act. Remember this, Mary? When you left, it was the law of the land. Now that you're back, there's an open question as to whether it's going to stand up at all to the scrutiny of the U.S. Congress. The surprise: David Drucker of Washington Examiner joins. David, the president's remarks this morning about a fix, and there are many metaphors for this. The president also talked about the disappointing website, the healthcare.gov. He called that a fumble. He spoke of rollouts. There were metaphors in all directions. I want to focus on the fix, however, and the politics of this. That's what you write about very carefully. I begin by saying that the president's greatest supporter is the editorial page of the New York Times and the editor of the editorial page of the New York Times. Editors of editorial pages are significant allies for any president, anytime. And Andrew Rosenthal has been stout-hearted for the president and especially for the Affordable Care Act. But tonight, Mary, and I mention this to you because you exist inside the editorial board world. It's separate from reporting.
It's a strange world.
You exist. You understand the dimensions of this, and so when an editor of an editorial page writes a note, it's significant. I pay attention to it. It isn't the will of the editorial board, but it's a measure of where the editorial page is going. And Mr. Rosenthal writes very carefully this afternoon, after the president's announcements, after the tangle that you'll momentarily hear about from David Drucker. He writes that this leaves us with the disturbing impression, and not for the first time in this administration, that Mr. Obama sometimes shoots from the hip, that he is still struggling to handle the politics of the presidency after nearly 5 years in office, and that he is surrounded by people who are too incompetent or too weak to help him. Oof. That's the stout heart ally of the President of the United States. Incompetent, weak, from the hip, struggling, a president. David, a very good evening to you. You are on Capitol Hill all day. Is there an understanding of the way forward, Republican or Democrat, after the president's weak and incompetent measures today at the White House? Good evening to you, David.
Good evening, John. And I think everybody's still waiting to see how this thing shakes out. We're trying to get their hands around the president's administrative regulatory fix. Meanwhile, of course, House and Senate Republicans are critical of it and believe a lot more needs to be done. I think the key to understanding this, and I was sort of ruminating on it all day, is that what the president did was consistent with the administration's effort to buy enough time to get to a point where the website is working such that they can say, look, it's working, and they hopefully have a flood of people into the website and into new Affordable Care Act mandate policies. Because if you look at what this does, it leaves liberals who believe in Obamacare unhappy, because if insurance companies actually went along with it, it could undermine the financial structure of the Affordable Care Act. Republicans clearly aren't satisfied with the law in its entirety. For people who've had their plans canceled already, it doesn't do much. And for insurance companies whom this whole scheme depends upon, they're being asked to do something that may be logistically impossible.
David, it may be consistent with that political goal to try to buy time to shove more people into the exchange to make it financially viable. But explain to us how this is consistent policy-wise, because it wasn't so long ago that the president was denouncing these very policies that he's now saving for a year as substandard, sold by insurance companies that were bad actors.
Right. So, Mary, it's a good point. Politically, this is consistent. Policy-wise, this is very inconsistent. The president has, and his allies who believe in this law, have been saying for 4 years that the insurance industry is a big racket, and they're going to bring order and security to it. They're going to lower costs and give you more for less. And that the calculation they made when they were passing the law, well, that we're not really sure what calculation they made. We can talk about what the president said today, and he basically said this, that he didn't realize as many people would be affected by the canceled plans, but in any event, he thought people would basically be so happy to get more for less, they wouldn't mind having their plans canceled. And if you talk to Democrats, the one thing they keep going back to is, but the plans people have are lousy. Maybe they just don't realize how bad it is and how good Obamacare is going to be for them. And many Democrats who have been flummoxed by the fact that the law politically and from a popularity standpoint hasn't taken off will just say in conversation, don't people realize how bad this is and how good the change is?
A puzzle. Mary, I put this to you. I'm a consumer. You're a consumer. David's a consumer.
Sure.
I don't like people to come along and tell me, John, and I do, I have a 99-cent pair of reading glasses, okay? That's all I spend because I lose them all the time. I don't want somebody to come in the room and say, John, what are you doing with those substandard reading glasses? They're hurting your eyes. They're flimsy. They suggest you're a cheapskate. Here, take this much better pair of reading glasses. Yes, it's $20. You can afford it. And give me those 99-centers back. That's what this feels like, David and Mary. And I appeal to you, Mary. They're telling us what we have to do, and they're condemning our choices.
Well, and to make matters even worse, John, they pretended that they weren't going to make you buy that expensive set of glasses.
And give up my glasses.
And give up your glasses. And I think that's why Democrats are running for the hills right now for political cover. I can't take the president seriously when he said today in the press conference, I had no idea all these people were going to lose their policies. I mean, that's just not credible because that's how the entire program was designed. David, I put to you a quote from the press conference today. This was the president's apology. He said, and I quote, "There is no doubt that the way I put that forward unequivocally ended up not being accurate." Can you make sense of that?
Yeah.
Was there an I'm sorry in there?
Yeah, we speak English, David. Help us. You're in Washington.
Well,
You're speechless, right? I'm speechless. I don't have anything to say.
well, I think that's as close to the president is going to get to saying that he did not tell people the truth about what the law was going to do. And John, we talked about this law now for 4 years?
David, when in March of 2010, from January to March of 2010, Mr. Drucker was here. We followed the Scott Brown story. David, I remember you telling me this. I learned from you on this. It was always going to do what it's doing.
Right. We all knew it was going to happen. And in fact, fans of the law, in the world that I'm in journalism and policy, the people who support the law say, well, of course it was supposed to be disruptive.
Right.
Because we don't like what exists and we wanted to disrupt it and change it into something better. And they're concerned that the president is undermining the premise of the law, which is what people have isn't good and they shouldn't want it.
But David, why didn't he say that when he was trying to gain political support? Is it because he didn't have to?
Because it wouldn't have
the Democrats ran Congress?
People people had complained about the cost of their insurance and it was going up and they didn't like it. But they liked the coverage they had. They liked the doctors. Most Americans had insurance. And of those, most of them generally liked what they had. And what the president was trying to do was deal with the people who didn't have insurance, but to get everybody else to go along. And in order to finance the pre-existing conditions and all of that, to get them to go along, he had to tell them everything would be fine. And that was a political calculation.
He didn't have to get anybody in Congress. I mean, the Democrats voted for this, not the Republicans. So why lie to the American people if you can get it through Congress?
Because I think the calculation was if we tell people the truth, I don't know if they calculated this, but had they told people the truth, you're going to lose the coverage you had, but don't worry, it'll be better. I think the feeling is the uprising would have been greater, and you might have lost Democratic votes. And just look at the uprising you've seen over the past 10 days and how Democrats have been running for the hills.
And my memory is they didn't have a margin in the House of Representatives in March of 2010. And David, did the Democrats accept this today? What did you hear late tonight on the Hill?
It's mixed. For some Democrats, particularly the leadership in the House and the Senate, this is enough. And for some of the Democrats that had been concerned, that had been signing on, at least in the Senate, to the Landrieu proposal, this is enough. For others, they said, well, we still would like a legislative fix. We're not sure this is enough. I'd like to go further. I'd like people to be able to keep their plans for longer than just a year. But I think generally this has quelled the revolt for now. But it tells you that people, I think it's more, the canceled plans is a big issue. I think what is really hurting them, though, is the credibility issue, because basically it's gotten around that everybody told us something that isn't true, and voters don't like that.
David Drucker.
They can deal with mistakes, but not lies.
David Drucker of Washington Examiner. Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. Weak, incompetent, struggling, shoots from the hip. President of the United States. New York Times editorial board. Director, Andrew Rosenthal. I'm John Batchelor.